A most original and creative talent in our business. Would you welcome Mr. Orson Welles?
Ladies and gentlemen, Orson Welles again, come to call for another visit.
Good evening. This is Orson Welles.
Well, hello again. This is Buck Benny speaking. I am joined with my team of Orson fanatics, and we love Orson Welles, and we love chatting about these commentaries. This is the second commentary about Orson Welles. And for this commentary, we're going to start off with Terry talking about a little bit about the commentary and what he pulled out of it. We're going to have Terry Phillips with us, of course, Kathy Fuller-Seeley, Vincent Longo, and Zach Eastman, all to give kind of our insights into these commentaries as we go. And I think we'll just go ahead and get started because these commentaries always go kind of long anyway. So let's go with Terry first. Terry, what stood out to you in this one, and kind of bring us up to speed?
A little difficult to think about how this might have been presented today, because so much has changed since September 23rd, 1945, when this commentary was originally broadcast. And the most interesting thing about this one is how, looking back all these years later, Welles was right about some things and very wrong about some other things. But he was passionate in what he said and had lots to say, beginning with some predictions. He first makes reference to a prediction by a man in Pasadena that did not come true. And I must confess, I had no idea what he was talking about, so I did a little research. And on September the 21st, 1945, the world was supposed to end. And that was according to the Reverend Charles Long, who in 1945 was known by everybody because he was a very prominent religious figure, American clergyman, who, among other things, predicted that the world would end.
Well, you could say he was a long way off.
He was a very long way off. And so he changed his prediction when he woke up. And then the world was going to end on September 29th, which it didn't. And then it was going to end in October of 1946 and then in 1947. And along the way, nothing happened. So with that background, Welles said, well, I guess I can make some predictions too. And so he predicted three things. Now, again, this is September 23rd, 1945. Orson Welles predicted that within 3 years, there would be 9 countries in the world with the atomic bomb. Guess which prediction came true? Not that one. The next country after the United States, which at that time was the only nation in the world with the atomic bomb, the very next country was, of course, the Soviet Union. And it didn't get the bomb until 1949, 4 years later. And then, of course, the other countries that followed took even longer to get the atomic bomb. And it never reached the number 9. I'll just quickly mention the 8 countries which had it: the United States, Russia, today Russia, the Soviet Union at the time, Great Britain. Number 4 was China, followed by France, and then many years later, India and Pakistan. And the 8th country, which has never formally acknowledged that it has an atomic bomb, but by all indications does, is the state of Israel. But it never reached the number 9, which was Welles' prediction, and it certainly didn't happen within 3 years. But it's okay, everybody's entitled to be wrong. His second prediction was about a man named Eric Johnson, who later became known as Eric Johnston, after his parents got divorced and his last name was modified by his mother. And Johnson was a very prominent figure in 1945, and even before. He was an American emissary in many places around the world, including representing American interests in the Soviet Union before Averell Harriman became our ambassador there. He was very involved, he was a very prominent businessman, very involved in Republican politics, but was very supportive of FDR during the war, and became the head of the Motion Picture Association of America, even before it was called the MPAA. It had a different, longer name. Welles refers to him as being the new head of the Hayes office. He wasn't actually the head of the Hays office. The Hays Code was sort of taken over by the motion picture producers.
Brand
And
office and stuff like that.
right, and he did eventually become the head of that. And Welles predicted he would be very good for the motion picture industry, and he was, although he was also a controversial figure. And then the third
Can I interrupt
prediction
you there for a second, Terry? Is that all right?
Yeah.
I want to
Yeah.
I want to swing over to Zach for just a second because he's our
Yeah.
motion picture special. Can you explain, Zach, a little bit about what the Hays Code was and why it came about, and what just for listeners that aren't fully versed?
Yeah, and I'm sure Kathy can tag into this as well because she's got way more experience on me. But there was a time when the morality of Hollywood was of huge question. I should say it's still a question that people seem to ask for some reason. But at the time, it was deemed that the motion picture industry was the cause of a lot of immorality around the country and a lot of devious behavior. And there was a code put in place that Hollywood didn't very much keep to until certain events really pushed them into the code had to be solidified. So post 1933, 1934, I want to believe, Kathy, you have the code in strict force. That's why we refer to some films as pre-code, because you can see there's a lot more salacious content, a lot of mostly sexual content, also extreme violence, as could be shown of that time. Controversial issues could be much more addressed in a freer zone. Once this Hays Code is instilled in this production code, combined with state and local censor boards, which did exist and were a further source of headache for the studios, Hollywood had to tighten its grip on its content, and that's why you see a lot of content become fluffy, become saccharine, and a lot of studios deciding to not touch certain genres. Most of the gangster genre and the horror genre get the biggest hits to the head when it comes to these production codes, and eventually they learn how to circumvent those and also to, frankly, just kind of ignore certain things past a certain point post World War II, because you have a revitalization of gangster by way of noir, and horror films found their resurgence in a way that gave you a little bit of what you wanted from the past, but also kind of toned it down. I think The Wolfman might be the most salacious that comes in the post-code era. And so with Johnston entering what would then become the Motion Picture Association of America, it is a sense of the times changing. We're aware that in a post-war world, the world is a lot more awakened to things that an isolationist country might have been very hesitant to let out there in the world. Keep in mind that this is a production code that also tells us that we shouldn't be addressing the problems of Nazism in our films up until Warner Brothers actively decides to break that with the Confessions of a Nazi Spy. So it's a sign that the times are changing, and that's why he probably refers to the idea of him being good for the motion picture business. But I do find it's interesting that he says, yet we still won't be able to show the same amount of stuff that we find in a comic strip. And I found that very interesting, because you not too long after this, you get the Frederick Wortham controversy surrounding the comic book industry, and that whole nonsense. But you do have Welles acknowledging that things are improving, you can show more. He'd be able to show a lot of that with two of his more Hollywood-driven outings, with Lady from Shanghai and eventually Touch of Evil. So he's looking forward to this, clearly, but I also sense there's a little bit of general disdain for the idea of censorship in general.
Yeah. Kathy, do you know if, as far as I know, and correct me if I'm wrong, and maybe anyone else can jump in, I think the most interesting film series to view under this Hays piece is, I believe, the first Tarzan movie with Weissmuller is pre-code, and all the rest of them are post-code. And so you can watch that first one and certainly Maureen O'Sullivan, is that who plays Jane? She's very scantily clothed in that first one, and in the second one she has a complete like tunic sort of thing that's covering much more and things. And in the first one they had a nude swimming scene that she did, but I believe even pre-code they decided that was pushing it too much, and I think they cut it and didn't release that. But now of course on YouTube you can see the footage. It's not her. They at the time, and continue to do this, they used a body double for her to do the swimming scenes and so forth. So you're not seeing Maureen O'Sullivan when you see the naked swimmer, but it is fairly a risque piece for sure. When you see that piece, it's surprising that they would put that in a film, and you can see why they sort of came up with Hayes. But go ahead.
The context of applying up the sexuality and the violence was that the box office had dropped nearly 50%, and Hollywood was desperate to pull people back to the box office, and you use sex and violence to make people reluctant to get rid of a nickel or a quarter to come back to the movies.
So you're saying sex and violence sells? That's news to me.
I'm
I
shocked.
didn't know that.
Shocked. Well, not that shocked.
But certainly what and I so appreciate Terry bringing this up. Certainly what Orson would have looked forward to, I mean, hopefully in this new era of post-war things, might be that whole collapsing of that machinery of the production code, because not only did they censor films at the very end, but from the very beginning, a filmmaker had to submit the script, and they would go through the script with red pencils saying you can't do this and you can't do that from the very beginning. They would say these titles and these subjects can't be filmed. So certainly Orson Welles would have been, looking forward to a new kind of cinema, kind of like maybe the Italian neorealism or some other kinds of non-US cinemas that were exploring other topics.
Right.
So it's a good time to be optimistic, and I appreciate, Terry, that you telling us more about what he's being optimistic about.
And Kathy, the most tragic victim of the Hays Code, of course, was my favorite movie, Casablanca, which got drastically changed because you could not have any suggestion of Rick and Ilsa having had sex when they were both, well, she was married, but still when they were having an affair together in Paris. At the end, the ending was affected by the Hays Code because he had to let her go back with her husband. He couldn't have this, he couldn't follow his heart. So Casablanca and the Hays Code.
To give some context too as to why Welles might have some strong opinions, even because like he fell under censor boards in certain respects, but this idea at large, I think it's best summed up by The Case of the Black Cat from 1934, because that film has, amongst other things, satanic ritual and incest. And what's funny is that the Breen office told them, like, all right, you're hanging yourselves if you try to release this movie. But when we researched it for my show Ballyhoo, we found that the Catholic Legion of Decency had issues with it, but there were also Catholic groups that recommended it as family viewing.
Okay.
So Welles looks at a system like this and goes, well, this is nonsense. Like, this makes no sense because there's no unity in the discussion and there's no unity in opinion. So anything is subject to anybody's whims, like no different than Southern censors potentially being an issue with the Jack Benny Rochester team-up movies, were it not for the fact that team was so popular. That's a whole board that would be scolding a film for having a white man and a black man talking to each other, right? In casual conversation that wasn't subservience driven. So yeah, Welles is happy to see this kind of ease itself out of the consciousness of the public.
Yeah. Well, and I believe, Terry, you had more ground you were going to cover, so why don't we switch back?
One more prediction, and this becomes the basis for a number of future Welles commentaries, and it's about the London Peace Conference, where the foreign ministers and the American Secretary of State were represented and tried to work out what the world would look like after the Second World War. And it was a mess, and it was very controversial. There were walkouts, and the United States and the Soviet Union really came to, not to blows, but to loggerheads over whose forces would occupy which countries and who would be dominant in the world. And anyway, Welles points out that this would, and correctly so, that this would continue to be troublesome. And it was not only throughout the rest of this year, 1945, but the years to come. And was really the precursor to the Cold War. Now, Welles spends a lot of time in this episode talking about the USO. And without going into any details about this, it is really interesting to hear him talk about the right to criticize what the USO does or doesn't do. And he does it in a very even-handed way while not hesitating to give his own opinion. So he was a good reporter, if you will, and at the same time, a good commentator on this topic. One of the people he mentions, and there's a Jack Benny connection here, is Drew Pearson, who was a commentator, another liberal commentator and friend of Orson Welles, someone he admires. And the Benny connection, anybody care to guess the Benny connection to Drew Pearson?
Are you speaking of Drew Pearson? Is that who
Yes.
you're?
Yeah, I don't
I
know.
believe that's how it's pronounced according to the Benny show.
I don't know who Drew Pearson is. I only know that Drew Pearson was one of our finest commentators, and I will not hear anybody besmirching his name on this program.
Yeah, just to let listeners know, I think it was Don Wilson that was talking about
That's right.
Drew Pearson and mispronounced the name, and then it became this kind of running joke about how he couldn't pronounce the name correctly and so forth, and especially because Don Wilson's our announcer who usually gets everything right, and it became a big thing, and they brought it later in the show. The writers quickly threw something together for Frank Nelson to do. And Frank was like, this doesn't track, and they said, just do it, it'll be funny, it'll go. And so then he mentioned it again, and then the crowd just went crazy, and it worked very, very well.
You've got almost as big a laugh as Your Money or Your Life.
Yes, I would agree with that, and it was charming, and it was just a name check to the wrong pronunciation of Drew Pearson again, but it was done very well, and they just changed the joke slightly, and it played much better. So that was.
But
good.
for Welles in this commentary, Drew Pearson's name, of course, was known by everybody. He was one of the most famous published figures in the United States. And not without controversy himself, of course, because he oftentimes had scoops that turned out to be incorrect, and oftentimes even based on false leads. But certainly as a fellow commentator, Pearson was widely known. The very last thing that I want to mention here comes at the very end of this commentary. And it kind of caught me by surprise because it came out of nowhere. He mentioned seeing a sign in a parking lot, either in Beverly Hills or somewhere in the LA area, I think. And the sign said, "No bailment created here." And Welles said, and maybe it was true, that he didn't understand what that sign meant. He didn't know the meaning of the word bailment. And he said, if anybody can tell me what that means, I'll give you, free tickets to my movie or something, whatever the prize was. Now, I have to confess, I spent a year in law school. At the end of that year, the law school and I agreed that we would go our separate ways. But during that year, I remember learning the meaning of the word bailment. And so I will put it on the table here. Do the rest of you know this term and why there would be a sign at a parking lot that says no bailment created here? And whoever gets the right answer will get a free sneak preview to the next episode of Imaginary Theater.
And I don't know what the meaning of the word parking lot is, so you may have to.
So you're really at a loss.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, I'm just kind of sitting here drooling.
But it's not a the bump to keep you from rolling out of your space? The thing my
No, but it's
my
a
bumper
great
gets hooked
answer.
up on?
Yeah.
Great
I think did it mean you can't leave like things there like garbage and so forth? I mean, I'm not sure.
No, you're warm, but not
Because
quite.
I remember when I first did this one, I looked it up and I knew what it meant at that point because I explained to people what it meant, but I can't remember now. It's been a year and a half or whatever it's been, and so I can't remember what I looked up.
Well, a bailment is a legal responsibility. If I give you my, I don't know, let's say I have an expensive item of jewelry, and I say, I want you to hold on to this for me. I'm going out of town, and I need you to take care of it. And you do, and I come back, and you have lost it or given it away, or it was destroyed in a fire, and the fire was your fault. Well, in giving you my piece of jewelry, I've created a bailment in you. You have a legal responsibility for taking care of this very, very well. And in a parking lot, when you leave your vehicle, they don't want that responsibility. They want to say, no, you just are renting space on our property. No bailment created here. We're not responsible for your car. And oftentimes it'll be more explicit, but not responsible for the contents left behind in your vehicles. But that's, obviously that sign was written by a lawyer, and most people who park cars had no idea what the sign meant.
Yeah.
But that was supposed to be their disclaimer so that they were not responsible.
Okay, interesting. Yeah.
So no free
You
tickets.
still see that today. You just don't see them call it bailment. You just see them saying, "Yeah, not responsible for lost items or damage to vehicles or whatever." Parking.
But for many years, if you look on the back of the parking ticket that you were given, not a speeding ticket, but
yeah, ticket for parking there.
It would often have that legal language on it. It might still, I don't know.
Harry, this is a very long and convoluted way of telling me that I'm not allowed to park in your garage. I get it.
That's-
I won't do it again.
Well, that's not true, Zach. You can park there. I'm just responsibility.
That's right.
Okay. All right, fine. Fair enough.
If Vincent steals your car from Terry's garage,
problem.
then it's Terry's fault.
But Vincent, I'll show you where the keys are.
Well, we'll swing over to Zach then. Zach, was there anything else that you wanted to point out in this episode when you listened to it? Anything that stood out?
I think we need to address the bull in the room.
Yes.
And it's
I was thinking the same thing. So there you go. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, the bullfighting story, which is sort of a continuation from the first episode. His fascination with bulls, with bullfighting in general, is intriguing because it's a through line throughout most of his life. But it's also telling that he's still telling a story he tried to tell years ago, because this is the story that was supposed to be included in It's All True, the documentaries that he was making for the Goodwill program set up by Rockefeller. It's for people who don't have context, it's kind of a sore subject in the Welles camp. During the making of the Magnificent Ambersons at RKO, Welles was tapped for the creation of these documentaries for the Goodwill program of U.S. South America relations. So they wrap up Ambersons as fast as they can, and he is sent out there with a crew to film the carnival. What ends up happening is that Welles discovers a lot of injustice and racial prejudice going on in South America with darker skinned people down there. And he starts documenting that. And the governments of both the US and South America are like, no, we didn't ask you to do that. No. And Welles is like, yes. And the documentary reportedly went over budget. It didn't. Because number one, it probably would have been guaranteed by the US government, because if they were going to guarantee Walt Disney's productions, they were certainly going to guarantee Orson Welles' productions. Both figures, by the way, that lost a lot of money during the World War II years. So what ended up happening in this is, as he's trying to make this, Ambersons falls under the cutting knife of RKO who is insistent on butchering this film after one bad test screening, but that was then followed by a much more positive test screening in the California area. And they used this as the impetus to seize control from Welles. Welles at this time was both trying to film this documentary that spoke of impoverished peoples in South America, as well as the carnival, tied into trying to finish up Ambersons. But Ambersons falls out of his control. They reshoot it with far more DPs than were on the original set, because it wasn't just Stanley Cortez. There were more cameramen on the set of Magnificent Ambersons while Welles was directing it. And so his South America trip is kind of like a consequence, is like one of the impetuses for how he loses control of Ambersons. Because if he were in Hollywood, I guarantee you he would have been really much more actively involved. And part of It's All True with it being shelved is that there's imagery in there of lighter skinned people dancing with darker skinned people, which was a big no-no for the US government. They did not want that. And so the project falls and fizzles. Thankfully, the footage for the most part exists that was already shot, and thus there is a compilation from the 90s of this footage together, also telling the story of it, also called It's All True, that thankfully presents the footage. There was also controversy in the fact that there's I'm not as remembering of this piece, so Vincent may have to correct me, but there's a story that he tells in the documentary about people like fishermen or boatmen that caused a lot of controversy because one of them died amid the filming of this, and there was seen as an exploitative nature of how he was trying to finish that piece of the story and things that he did in order to finish that story. So it seems like it's a big, well-to-do issue for Welles that he may not want to ever touch again. And yet he's still clinging to those stories. So I was curious if anybody here had an insight into how Welles would still hold on to some of these, because we know he would hold on to projects to the point where some of them wouldn't even get released. But I didn't know if how much would he hold a grudge with the story itself versus the people who might have tanked it. Because it seems like, I mean, Don Quixote would be my best example of how he would always try to keep a story going, even if there was heartbreak surrounding it.
Vincent, you got anything on that?
Yeah, It's All True is no different than that. I mean, as you said, Zach, these stories from the filming of It's All True, I mean, Welles tells them in various forms throughout his career. I'm thinking of, the bull story, for example. He retells in 1955 show the sketchbook, Orson Welles' sketchbook. The story of the boatman, which you mentioned, he alludes to a lot of times. Largely, he alludes to it and talks about it from a sense of guilt and question of whether or not they should have went out and filmed that day, because essentially they were filming and he fell overboard. He was like this famous, extremely good boatman. But he did also mention, like, always the hope that he could get his hands on the It's All True footage, which they did keep around for a long time and obviously formed this later documentary. So I can't remember the exact details of it, but I've heard stories about him of people saying Welles would always say, "Oh, I would trade this footage or this amount of money to buy the footage back so that I could re-edit it." So it was always a dream of his to get his hands on that footage, because like you said, I think this is the moment where certainly films like Kane and his theater work were political, but I think he saw this as to get political on a global scale, to talk about race issues, which his films had not really dealt with. And so this was a really formative moment in sort of his politics and artistic sensibility. So I think he would have done anything to get it back. So certainly him telling these stories are like what he's holding on to, because he can't show it in any other way.
Yeah.
What's so amazing with him is he's already in a dicey area after Kane. And then instead of trying to do what most people would tend to do, which is kind of go, "Oh, okay, I'll go away from controversy for a while release a few films that will get me back in the good graces of people, and then I could start pushing the envelope again. He just keeps pushing, and he never seems to know like when to stop, or what would help his career or whatever. And he never thinks, it doesn't seem to think about the long term. He's more focused on the short term, and this is what I want to do, and I'm going to do it no matter what anybody says. And it's to the detriment of his long-term career and to what we get from him in the future. In this case, it sounds like Zach's saying and Vincent are saying that essentially him going down and filming this controversial piece, one, was so controversial that it couldn't get released. Two, that it messed up his Ambersons project by him being away from it at the time when he would have been able to defend it a little bit more and not maybe had them butcher it and so forth. So it like a double whammy on him by doing this.
Yeah,
am I in the right ballpark there, Zach, of what I'm saying?
Yeah, and furthermore, there are indications that RKO was, in certain respects, was conspiring against him. There's telegrams sent off between two officials at RKO that Joseph McBride uncovered not too long ago that really lay down the reality that they were already going to try to do this no matter what. It just really worked out that Orson was not in the country to really remind them of the contract that he signed, which is, you don't have to give me a lot of money, but I want control. And that's what they agreed to. And RKO actively shoved him out of that process. The following year, the slogan was showmanship instead of genius. Now, the trade-off is you do get Val Lewton in a couple, like within the year, but it comes at a heavy artistic cost to a lot of extent. Like you trade art for art. It's weird. But frankly, it speaks to the paradox of Welles, which is, on the one hand, he was maligned and ostracized by so many of the people in power. And yet there are times when he wasn't able to compromise to his detriment. I'm firmly in Camp Welles, but I'm fully aware of how Orson can destroy Orson given the chance. You know?
Right. Well, Kathy, did you have anything you want to throw in about the commentaries in general, or anything about any of the discussion we've had? Or are you good? Or
no, it just fascinates me. Is I've said before that I would love to teach a class just sort of based on Orson's commentary and doing making such a short period of time reminding us of how incredibly rich and controversial things are when it takes up a page in a history textbook. All these things coming to light is fascinating.
Well, and the fact that Orson can create a 15-minute commentary that we usually, ideally, if we had our druthers and could just spend as much time on it, we'd probably spend an hour talking about this 15-minute commentary every time. We have to edit ourselves as we're going and things, and so sometimes we edit ourselves a little more and we create a 15-minute intro or something, and sometimes we have a 45-minute intro. It just all depends. But it just shows how rich these commentaries are with ideas. And it's not just one idea, it's usually 3, 4, 5. And even when we cover things, if you go back and listen to the commentary, you'll be like, oh, nobody touched on that piece that would have been interesting to talk about. It's just, there's too much. And so there's too much to go over. I mean, this whole bullfighting thing, it's interesting in that in this episode, he talks about going and how it wasn't a very good bullfighting experience. It wasn't, he took his friends and he was hoping to like impress them or something to that effect is kind of what I got. And it wasn't, it sounds like it was a kind of a bloody fiasco of a bullfight, which some of them probably are. Terry, did you get that feeling when you were listening to it that it didn't go as he'd hoped?
Yeah, I did. And I think that's true, not only about that bullfight, but about these commentaries. I think if you were to talk to Orson Welles today, if we could dig him up and wake him up and have a conversation with him.
Wake up, come chat with us.
Oh, we can, Terry, we can.
give him a cigar and wind him up.
Where's my cognac?
I think he would say about these commentaries that they were, they were imperfect, that he could not say all that he wanted to say, not just because of the times, but because of the constraints of the medium. And first of all, he only had 15 minutes, and a couple of those minutes were taken up with commercial announcements. And beyond that, he had so much to say, and he said it very well. But for instance, he would tease us in the first episode. He teased us about something he'd say in the second one, and then didn't get to it.
Right.
And so in the second one, he said, well, I said I would talk about this today, going to have to be in a subsequent episode. And he meandered around a bit, just as we do in our commentaries about the commentaries.
Yes.
But it was frustrating to me as a listener to know that there was so much more for him to say. And there was the limitation of the forum.
Yes.
And B, there was the fact that he only got to do it for how long? A year and change?
Yeah.
So it's a pity that we only got this much of Orson Welles, and that he had by today's terms, a relatively short life also. There was much more for him to do. One of the interviews that I watched with Orson Welles in talking about his life, his career, he indicated in answering a question about Citizen Kane, that was the only time he had the total creative control in his contract. And he said he could make another even better film than Citizen Kane if he had that provision again, if he had that degree of control.
Yeah.
But he didn't. And so we had the Orson Welles we had. I'm delighted that we have all these commentaries. I learned so much about the history of our country and what was going on at the time, and about how to best present a controversial point of view in a way that's inclusive, that everybody can hear something that they can agree with, but that still leaves you with a strong point of view. It was just brilliant.
Yeah. Well, and I wish that they, I don't know. You can't tone him down. He's Orson, so it is what he is, and we have as many as we have. I just sometimes wish or yearn for, if he would have done this for like 15, 20 years, that we would have had this huge bank of going through history and being able to experience it firsthand through him. And that would have been delightful. But at least we have a year of this. And on top, he did similar things to this in different ways that we'll be able to talk about and things as we go too. Zach, you were going to say?
I was going to say he would have loved YouTube and podcasting for that very intent and purpose. When you think about it, like this, all the things that Welles wanted to accomplish would have been at his beck and call had he, say, been born 30, 40 years later. And we're not going to live in the what if land here, but there would be a strong Orson Welles podcast following on Spotify if he had the opportunity to present his viewpoint on the world. And in a lot of sense, he might have diverged from movies as a result of it, unless, of course, it meant that, well, if I keep spending money and make Don Quixote, I can put it up on YouTube or Vimeo and get the audience that I want there. It's something that Kevin Smith's kind of more leaned into, of just like, I know my audience is here and I'm going to make movies for my audience, as opposed to trying to make something for a big mass audience that isn't existing and isn't coming. And so, like, in a lot of respects, these commentaries provide an early form of what we are inundated with on a daily basis, whether for good or for bad. And in a lot of sense too, you get the sense of a creative who his ex-wife would say about him, like, he knew nothing of being social, but you put a camera in front of him, a new camera, and he'd figure out how it would work immediately. Yeah. So he's very aware of how to adapt to a new technology, but in a very Kane fashion, in his terms. Those are the terms that any man only knows his own, and he lived by that to the last living breath on the Merv Griffin show.
That's great. Zach, you raise an interesting question, and I wonder whether either Kathy or Vincent might know the answer to this. Do we have any data on the size of his audience on these radio commentaries? Do we know how many listeners there were?
There were four. There were four listeners. They tried to build the audience, but they wrote a lot of letters, those four people. So
it's just us. Daryl doesn't even listen to them.
I've got something from ratings that for a sort of Sunday afternoon at 1 o'clock, he was getting kind of a 5 share, whereas, you know, at this time, Jack Benny was getting a 25 share. But still, I mean, that's, Vincent, have you found, because I did a cursory look through newspapers.com to find references of people talking about him. And, but have you found in your research more reaction or reception?
I mean, there isn't a whole lot of reception. You know, people acknowledge the show. I haven't seen that it was really not watched. You know, I haven't seen the opposite, which is like the negative. You know, later in the show, we get a lot of chatter from African-American newspapers, which you talk a lot about later. That's when you start to realize, like, whoa, people are listening to it. But it doesn't, I mean, eventually the conservative commentators will start using Welles as a sort of whipping boy. So you get a sense that people are listening to it there, but you never get a great sense that people are listening to it, but you don't get a great sense that people are like really not listening to it either. So I feel like Kathy said, we have some sense of at least at one point what their ratings are, but this is also a Sunday afternoon. He acknowledges like people are getting out of church. Like, I'm not really sure that this was set up to be a huge listenership. So I think it just has a low bar and it just jumps over that low bar.
Using
That's the
today's,
sense that I get.
using today's term, would we have called Orson Welles an influencer?
Maybe.
Possibly.
Maybe.
Since he was heard by people who mattered to him and who then presented his views to others.
Well, it was clearly enough to get exposure to Woodard's case. And the thing that I look at it is it's like an extension off of the initial principle in which Mercury Theater on the Air was instituted. It was instituted by CBS as part of elegant programming to bolster their presence. So they paid for it. It was CBS giving that time over to Orson and this company to do that show. And in a respect, you know, ABC is giving Welles that same form and function, but that doesn't necessarily constitute them promoting the hell out of it. You know,
Right.
like it really boils down to, is it enough to spark the same controversy and listenership that a certain event in New Jersey did?
Well, I'm
know?
sure that they would like to be able to say, of course, you know, of our things that we air, one of the things we have Orson on our station. Isn't that lovely? And they're probably hoping they're like, Orson, just take this little corner of 15 minutes, do what you want to do, but let's not create a whole turmoil over it or anything. They're just hoping whatever he does, but for them, he's just a name check that they could go, well, we have the great Orson Welles on our channel, on our station or whatever. So
that's always a mistake with Orson. Don't do that. Like, if you're wanting something calm, that's not the answer to your question.
And yet they keep trying to do that with Orson, hoping that, oh, well, sure, he'll rein himself in this time. Well, he's learned his lesson. It's like, no,
A true man cannot be tamed. Certainly one who is not so fond of Paul Masson wine.
Hey, very good.
I think
Zach,
though that they want.
Go ahead, Vincent.
I was just going to say, I think that if we look at the only evidence of why Lear Radio and ABC thought this was a good idea, I think that they thought that Welles could do commentary in a dramatic fashion. They were like, well, this has got to go somewhere. And so Welles is a name, and I think he can do it in an interesting way. I'm not sure they thought about the consequences of what he was actually going to start saying, but he can, you know, like we always talk about, at the end of the day, you know, the guy's got a hell of a voice, and he is eloquent and creative. And so I think just from an aesthetic point, you know, it seems like an obviously great idea. But, you know, he gets charged up and you got to deal with that.
And at the time, they do have folks that are getting a lot of audience listens and things for talking about sort of Hollywood gossip sort of thing. And I think that's a little bit about, one, what he sort of played up with them. He definitely does more of that on these early episodes. And then two, what they were kind of hoping he would do. And it's like, okay, if he does the whole Hollywood thing, he's got an inside track to a lot of people and could share stuff that maybe listeners will go, oh, did you hear Orson talking about this gossip about whatever, and tune in. But they got less and less of that, and they got more and more of the political bent, which is not what leads to, I don't think at the time, listeners also, it leads them into trouble, and they weren't probably happy about that. I did want to dovetail on what Zach said really quick, and just the two people that I think would be so interesting if they were still around today to see what they would do with YouTube, with podcasting, with all these things, are of course Orson Welles and Jack Benny, because Jack would go from vaudeville to radio to television, and even without him, we've dragged Jack into the world of podcasting and into the world of YouTube and things, and that's without him having any active participation, being as he passed away in '74. So having him alive and doing things would have been such an interesting thing to see what he would do. And of course, with Orson, in any medium that he was involved in, he was always interesting. So seeing what he would have done would have been interesting as well. But I think we'll leave it there. Thank you, folks. I hope you enjoy this episode. Don't forget to tune into the episode. We actually have Orson after we're done talking, whether you know it or not. And we'll be back next week for some more Orson, sharing about Orson and his commentaries. What an interesting treat you have in store for yourself if you keep listening to these commentaries. It's so interesting, the directions that they'll go in the future. I think these first ones, to me, aren't as strong as some of the later ones, but they're still interesting. So we'll go with that. Thanks, everybody.
Stay tuned to this station for KECA's new program with Orson Welles. This is Orson Welles. Today I'd like to give you two sides of a big argument in Hollywood, and I'm sticking my neck way out and making a couple of predictions. We'll get to that in just a minute.
But first, we want to tell you something about the makers of Lear radios. Many of you may not have heard of Lear radios. We're not surprised, because not many of you fly a plane. But if you do fly, in fact, if you've flown a plane any time since 1930, the name Lear is an old friend to you. For you see, that name has been on fine aircraft radios for more than 15 years. It's been on radios made to keep pilots steadily in touch with their fields, the kind of radios made to guide them unerringly on their courses. This is why we say that since 1930, Lear has been the name men fly by. Now, for the first time, Lear is building home radios. And you can guess what is happening. All that experience with extra precision, all that knowledge of what makes the finest in radio, all that ability to make dependable, efficient sets, is going into fine home radios you can get for your home. In a few minutes, we'll tell you more about these Lear home radios. And now, the words we always use in these broadcasts. Mr. Welles' opinions are his own and do not necessarily represent the views of Lear Incorporated.
Where you live, has the world come to an end? Around here, everything seems fairly normal. But according to a man over in Pasadena, the whole works was supposed to be all washed up the day before yesterday. A number of his ardent followers prepared themselves for the explosion by saying their prayers and holding their ears. But my best information is that the world, including Pasadena, is still open for business. But the prophet, occupationally dauntless, is back at his trade. It's the queerest of all trades, this soothsaying, and, whether plied by statesmen or phrenologists, the most dispensable. We have beheld our military leaders, heavy with wisdom and gold braid, recording their guesses on many a front page and getting it wrong every time. And then there's Drew Pearson. As a Washington reporter, he's one of our most valuable institutions. But I think my friend Drew is most diverting in those eerie moments when he picks up his little crystal ball and reads the future. And most of the time, Pearson the prophet gets it right. Accepting only his public guessings, which after all are based on Drew's own canny observation, I take a poor view of all forms of rune casting, augury, bump and wrinkle reading, and horoscope making. Be it political or personal, I think fortune-telling is the bunk. But although I now propose to peer into the future, and once upon a time myself broadcast some trifling threats concerning the world's ending, don't think I take myself as seriously as the man in Pasadena. It is not generally known in the typical Drew Pearsonian phrase, and it will be officially denied. But the fact is that I was not born with a veil over my face, and when a babe I was not stolen away by the gypsies. In spite of which serious handicaps, here I go with a whole handful of predictions. Prophecy number 1. 9 countries will have the atom bomb within 3 years. That's the best private guess in our State Department and in the foreign ministries of the world. Prophecy number 2. Eric Johnson, a good man, will do a good job for the motion picture industry. Sub-prediction. The group he's taking charge of will still be called the Hayes Office, and we movie makers still won't be able to put things on the screen which are allowed daily in every comic strip. Prophecy number 3. Next week we'll see a general speed-up in the London Conference of Foreign Ministers. But the peoples of the world will find the results unsatisfactory. Hot tip department. In the Army, the chiefs of the Entertainment Committee are working out a plan for entertainment in the next World War. Bureau of Unanswerable Questions. In the midst of atomic battle, who will entertain who? And where will the performances take place? This brings up the current argument on the matter of USO camp shows. In Hollywood, several of our leading citizens have found time in their busy lives to take a rap at entertainment for the GIs overseas and to raise rumpuses about accommodations and even such vaudevillians trivia as billing and publicity. Now, these beefers are not all of them chronic prima donnas or fluff-brained hams. The most convincing and impassioned of all the complaints came from one of the nicest men I know in our business, Frank Sinatra, who says a lot of USO shows insult the intelligence of the GIs and that lots of special service officers are, to quote him, shoemakers in uniform. Another friend of mine whose service overseas exceeds his record by 17 weary and often dangerous months comes right back at him with language even stronger. This was Marlene Dietrich, who spent the better half of 1 year letting me saw her in half in the Mercury Wonder show for servicemen. Recently, she spent her furlough as our house guest, and before she left for Paris again last week, Marlena reminded me that there have been sent overseas up to now 700 entertainment units, that there's been a show every 2 weeks in every Army and Navy hospital in the country, the grand total being 64,989 performances. I asked Bob Hope about it. Well, I've been traveling all over the world for the last 4 years, Orson, Bob told me, and maybe in some of the places we went to, some of the time, little mechanical things weren't just what they ought to have been. But the effort was always there, and the effort was always good. There have been a lot of beefs about the inefficiency of the whole Army, but we won the war, didn't we? And as for the USO and the special service officers involved in it, a tremendous amount of entertainment went to a tremendous number of boys. They needed it mighty badly. Now I hear there's talk about reducing the budget for entertainment, and that's bad. The men overseas are more homesick than they ever were, and they need cheering up more than they ever did. But wait a minute, said Bob. You just wanted a word or two from me. You didn't ask for a book. So I thanked Bob Hope and told him that just about wrapped it up, and I think it does, too. I might add, however, that if General MacArthur can speak out of turn, as a lot of people think he did last week, it isn't very surprising that a couple of actors may possibly have spoken out of turn, too. Sinatra, as a matter of fact, feels every bit as righteous as MacArthur. And with very good reason, too, I think, because the kick he launched wasn't his. Hundreds of fighting men with bad recreational equipment, things like that, asked him overseas as a free, uncensored civilian to speak up in their behalf. But from now on, I guess Frank agrees with me that all squawks against overseas entertainment for GIs had better come from the GIs themselves or be directed to those of us who aren't in uniform and can never do enough. You may remember the woman from Weehawken. Whatever a fan is, she's the opposite. She wrote me the opposite of a fan letter before this radio series even started, demanding to know why it should start at all. Well, here's the second broadcast, and here's another letter from Weehawken already. Dear Madam, you'll excuse me, please, ladies and gentlemen, if I pause again to answer my mail. Dear Madam, concerning my comments on the political scene, you say I sound like one of those starry-eyed dreamers who wants to give a bottle of milk to every Hottentot. To this, madam, I can only say that if giving said milk to said Hottentot will make him a customer for an icebox to keep it in, I think the milk is a good business investment. A couple of days ago in New York, several Americans sat down to the typical meal of a liberated European. The main course consisted of a single canned sardine. And the entire dinner was consumed in about the same length of time it's taken me to tell you about it. Such meals are being held in towns and cities throughout the country, and the difference in the cost is being put into a fund to purchase available food for shipment to our allies in this recent war. May I suggest, madam, that you treat yourself one day next week to such a meal. You may be glad to lose a pound or two. I know I am. Anyway, it'll help you get my point. If we Americans would eat 3 less ounces of meat a week and save the amount or cost of these 3 ounces in money, we'd be able to take care of the meat shortage in Europe for the entire winter. I'd like to see such a program organized with the same ingenuity and enthusiasm we've given to our bond drives. I know we could do it because we are a generous people. We're also shrewd businessmen. Anyway, we have been up to now. We ought to know we can't do business with a bankrupt world. And, madam, the welfare of a woman across the ocean from you is the welfare of Weehawken. The people of Europe, to name just one continent, are your next-door neighbors. Unless they're eating properly, your neighborhood will get to be very run down and shabby-looking. You'll find yourself living in a slum and without any place on our planet to move to. Thanking you for your interest, my dear madam, I remain as ever your obedient servant. Oh, P.S. I find it difficult to believe that last week's mention of bullfighting encouraged the Weehawken young to civil violence and the 10 varieties of mayhem you're kind enough to catalog. But I promise you, one more broadcast and the subject is closed. And you know, friends, come to think of it, I'm glad my critic from Weehawken wasn't with us in Tijuana last Sunday afternoon. You remember I told you Rita and I were taking Joe Cotton and Lenore across the border for their first corrida? Well, we arrived at that border with just time enough and then discovered that we'd locked the trunk compartment in the back of the car and left the key at home. The customs men, persuaded that we were so many jewel smugglers, made us park stateside of the line and proceed on foot. Once in Mexico, we chartered a taxicab made out of what must surely have been the second automobile ever built. And in this we floundered and jounced, feeling like the makings of a Maya milkshake for long ages. I reminded my wife and friends what Chesterton had to say about adventure. Adventure, I quoted between agonized gasps, adventure is an attitude taken towards discomfort. And at this, the 4 of us struck the right attitude and the roof of the car. Well, at long last, we came to the bull ring and found a faena in full tilt. It was the first, and I'm very, very much afraid the last, that Joe Cottons will ever see. It happened to be a very bad bullfight, which means it was a very bloody farce. The man and the beast went at each other without the semblance of dignity. There were, besides, unpleasant accidents. Nothing will convince the Cottons that Rita and I are not more than a trifle touched in the head on this matter of bullfighting, knowing full well that most of you listening must share their suspicions, certainly their sympathy for the bull. I offer in our defense a little story, a true story. But first, your attention, please, for an interesting announcement.
For just a minute or so, we'd like to tell you a little about the new Lear radios. We say new because they haven't been seen before in homes. Only aviators have had them. They were made only for the exacting service of the airlanes. This kind of manufacture takes special craftsmanship. And it's this kind of craftsmanship Lear knows best. It's the kind of craftsmanship and precise engineering that goes into the Lear radio for your home. The Lear line gives you a wide range to choose from. Some sets include television. Some have record players and automatic record changers. Some provide the wonderful Lear recording you've seen advertised. And there's FM and worldwide shortwave. With all their fine engineering and latest developments, you might expect Lear radios to be high-priced. But they're not. And now, Mr. Welles has a few words about next week.
Well, next week we'll have the story. It turns out there isn't time enough for it now. It goes something like this. Once there was a bull, a fighting bull, whose name was Bonito, and who lived in a ranch where fighting bulls are raised and grew up with his fellows, fed and pampered, as such creatures always are, and thoughtfully avoided by all humans, avoided by all, that is, except one, a little boy, the child of one of the ranch hands. Between this fighting bull, Bonito, and this little boy, there grew up a friendship as real and warm as any ever known between a boy and his dog. The villain of this little drama, you'll be glad to hear, is the bullfighter. And better still, there's a happy ending. But now I'll have to say goodbye, in the words of the serial. To be continued. And I promised you, remember now, to tell about the greatest man in modern popular music. But I haven't room left on this quarter of an hour to do him justice, so we'll put him off till next time. Anybody who guesses his name gets a free membership in the club I'm founding for the occasion. Anybody who can tell me what the sign in the parking lot in front of the ABC studios means gets a handful of free tickets to their favorite radio show and my everlasting gratitude. The sign reads, "No bailment created here." I will repeat that. The exact words of the sign are as follows: "No bailment created here." I asked my lawyer about it. He was evasive. I even asked the man who runs the parking lot. "What does bailment mean?" I demanded, "and who'd want to create it?" "I've been working here for 2 years," he told me, and I've never been able to find out. Maybe I'll have the answer by next week. Anyway, please let me come to call again. Thanks for this time. Till next Sunday, same time, same station, my sponsors, the makers of Lear Radios, and I remain, as always, obediently yours.
This is the American Broadcasting Company.